My guild and I tried to cook some team comps and strategies that involved TOVE this co-op. There were many surprises, and some of the strategies that we used are things you probably don't know or don't notice normally. I'm here to show our findings to you, and maybe you might even consider TOVE more in the future. These strategies might be used in co-op this time around, but it's possible to be used in other contents when situations line up. But first, let's talk about how we cook. We usually start with using bunny girls with litter and Mr. Kanto's Alice because his Alice is kinda cracked. So we use him to carry our co-op. By the way, if you're in NA and want top 10% rewards, we usually do these co-op carry runs since competitive scene in co-op isn't very much active. Some people who just wants that carry for some extra rewards, they can get carries in my streams. So whenever co-op is up, come join us as we usually enjoy exploring co-op and the limits of the game. However, no matter how much of a big carry Mr. Kanto's Alice can be used, a relatively low investment guilty could actually out DPS Alice. This is when we thought that maybe Alice might not be the proper play on this. There's not much pierce or core bonus damage that we could take advantage of for using Alice, and so we thought might as well just use DPS wind shotguns. Then we had Mr. Alter's Guilty help us out in our runs. For Modernia, Guilty is a pretty good DPS. This even showed some use in the last Modernia solo raid. This is because as a shotgun, their normal attacks do get through most of Modernia's area. Modernia being weak to wind allows our wind DPS Guilty to thrive. This also puts an emphasis to main DPS having elemental damage in their overloads. But there's one thing, wind DPS is basically non-existent right now. Aside from Guilty, there's not much in the meta that are being used, so we look into the next best one, which is Noir. Noir, even though an attacker, is more of a support in a sense. That is, she does provide buffs to the team as a whole, but there is nothing much about where she buffs herself alone or deals damage alone. But nonetheless, Noir is still there as an attacker as she has high inherent base attack compared to support or defender archetype. Not a lot of other people have invested in any other wind units. Even then, not many of them would be that successful in bosses anyways. You could kind of argue that D would be good, but the parts are so weak that the good part of her kit would not end up being that useful. She still has elemental advantage bonus though, and maybe we would have tried more with D, but we didn't have other people that have invested in her that we could use. This left us with two main DPS options, Guilty and Noir. Now you guys would know where we're heading to right now. Yeah, just put Tove, Guilty, Noir, and that's a shotgun team, right? I mean, yeah, that's the basics of it, but we have tried other strategies that you might not have thought of. First, let's look at our team's investments. My Tove is sitting at level 9 skill 1 and level 8 skill 2 and level 7 burst. The skill 1 is level 9 because that's where the highest breakpoint is, where you get 5% chance of proccing the skill 1 mechanics. So that one is definitely needed to keep the stacks. The level 8 was because I followed some guy that pointed out that level 8 was a breakpoint. They did say it hasn't been fully tested yet, so there's that disclaimer. However, I did ask Mr. Kanto, who's our resident expert at this after all of this, and after doing some further testing, there are different skill breakpoints for skill 2. In case you didn't know, Mr. Kanto was the one that helped us figure out that you also only really need 98.88% or 99% charge speed for Alice instead of 100% because of how frames work. For Tove skill 2 breakpoints where it will actually make a difference, Mr. Kanto has done some testing, and the TLDR of it is basically her skill 2 breakpoints are level 4, level 7, and level 10 at 60 FPS and level 7 at 30 FPS. There's some weird frame rounding differences that between 60 FPS and 30 FPS, which is why this is happening, but I'll leave the nitty-gritty details out. In case you don't know, the co-op is running at 30 FPS for reasons we don't know much, but it is what it is. This also explains why co-op rankings like machine guns do less damage than expected, and most people don't really use machine guns, and so that's why Modernia is not used that much. Then we have our Guilty, Mr. Alter's Guilty, sitting at 0 limit break and 40 elemental and level 7 skill 1, and we have two Noirs where one is sitting at max score but only 20% elemental, and then the other sitting at max limit break but with 60% elemental. Now let's talk about the runs that surpass even the runs that we have in NA. In JP, they reach over 500 mil with this team. They had way more investment on units than we did, and with more dupes and higher skill levels and higher elemental rolls probably. So they, just to put it to perspective, we attempted this same team and only did roughly 300 mil. The other guilty we had was not very invested, so we couldn't get any more invested with guilty. Knowing that we can't achieve doing the standard way that others did due to simply just having less investments, we had to explore other ways to min-max our damage with whatever and whoever we can access. We also didn't want to waste too much resources for now because there were potentially better units upcoming soon with the limited banners coming up. So then we decided with this tank strategy, using Tove, Blanc, Guilty, and 2 Noirs, we decided to take advantage of the characteristic that shotguns have: getting bonus damage while the enemy is close. In this strategy, we intentionally fail the boss's QTE mechanics and rely on Blanc's heal to heal us. Failing the boss QTE mechanics at specific times did allow the shotguns to get some bonus damage. But basically, we replaced that extra Guilty with Blanc instead and gained buffs from her, and get more damage via taking that advantage of the short range. This did allow us to get about 310 mil or so. It might not seem a lot because you also have to realize that based on the formula, range bonus does get mixed up along with other multipliers like critical damage, core damage, and full burst bonus damage. There's also that RNG factor that Tove's buffs, and so we couldn't really have a consistent damage range. In addition to that, having this strategy did require our shotguns to target the lower area of Modernia. Due to the shotgun's bad hit rate though, it was possible that we were missing some more pellets that offset our constant range bonus that we had. Executing this was a little bit more risky as we had someone managing the QTE, so even though I think that we could have min-maxed it more, there were other annoying factors like dealing with the QTE and that each run takes like 3 minutes plus loading times. But regardless, to say it was a fun discovery, fairly valid alternative and creative strategy that utilizes the in-game mechanics that people often not pay attention to. But then here's another strategy that we have thought of. This specific strategy is pretty much interesting because it's not a standard strategy that we initially thought when Tove was released. And this actually resulted in us getting the best damage considering with what we had in availability. It's actually using Tove, Litter, Guilty, and 2 Noirs. You might be wondering why this team is valid. Simply put, the method is to burst first with Tove, and then any subsequent burst from that will come from Litter. This way, we have Litter acting as a great damage buffer and also cooldown reductions. When we were doing the previous teams, we didn't have any Litter or any cooldown reduction because either Guilty provides more self damage or Blanc provides more team damage with her buffs. You might be wondering though, what about Tove's burst, right? It essentially gives about 80% attack buff coming from her own attack. Well, you see, there's actually a very interesting mechanic that one other character you might not be aware of. That is actually Guilty's skill 2. Her skill 2 increases the stack count of buffs by 1 for all wind allies. What this means is both Guilty and Noir actually gets to keep Tove's burst buff, meaning that they can get both Tove's burst buff and Litter's burst buff at the same time. On top of that, we also have cooldown reduction for the team because of Litter. There's additional caveats to this. For example, if Tove drops her stacks though, the burst buff stacks from Tove that is being kept by Guilty's skill 2 becomes only limited to 1 stack. We have to wait until Tove gets more stacks again with either 2 or 3 stacks before Guilty's skill 2 can refresh the stacks up higher. This means that Tove's buff stacks is hard cap based on Tove's stacks, but there is still a minimum of 1 that Guilty can keep up. In any case though, this is an interesting thing because this actually does give more complexity to this team. If we get more wind shotguns, especially in burst 3, this is something to explore as well. In addition to that, if there are more units released with that increased stack count, it can keep Tove's stacks consistency better. This new team ended us up with over 333 mil more points, which is like about 10% more team-wide damage than as if we were using Blanc instead. The different ways these units interact with one another does provide so much more variety on team building. Right now, it's rough to see this strat work outside of co-op because of the amount of available units right now, but with more units in the future, I could definitely see more team building opening up. In any case though, what do you guys think? I could see some future where we end up not using Noir with Blanc if this ever happens. Not saying it will always be the case, but it's such a nice breath of fresh air where we can start exploring different units outside of the typical copy-paste teams. Some may require a little bit more creativity than others, but hey, that's part of the fun in this game. Team building has always been one of my favorite things in gacha games. Can't wait to see what more other strategies and teams we can cook up with.